You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. If you are listening to the podcast of this, it is located at RudolfSteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. As well, there are two publishing houses, SteinerBooks.org in America and RudolfSteinerPress.com in England, who are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of the book, The Philosophy of Freedom, The Basis for a Modern World Conception by Rudolf Steiner. It is Collected Works, volume number 4. This is the translation by Michael Wilson, which has been re-edited by Rudolf Steiner Press for this special edition to mark the 150th anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's birth. I am going to begin with the notes on the translation by the translator Michael Wilson. This book was first translated into English by Professor and Mrs. R. F. Alfred Hoenle in 1916, and was edited by Mr. Harry Collison, who wrote that he was fortunate to have been able to secure them as translators, quote, through their thorough knowledge of philosophy and their complete command of the German and English languages, enabling them to overcome the difficulty of finding adequate English equivalents for the terms of German philosophy, close quote. Following the publication of the revised German edition in 1918, Professor Hoenle translated the new passages and other incidental changes that Dr. Steiner had made. For this 1922 edition, the title was changed at the author's request to The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity, with the added remark that, quote, throughout the entire work, freedom should be taken to mean spiritual activity, close quote. The reasons for this change and also for the present decision to change back to the original title are given below. The translation was revised in 1939 by Dr. Hermann Papelbaum, whose object was to, quote, check certain words and phrases from the strictly Steiner point of view, close quote. He wrote in his preface as follows, quote, the readers of the German original of this book will know that the author's argument is largely based upon a distinction between the different elements making up the act of knowledge. English philosophical terms are rarely exact equivalents of German philosophical terms, and the translator's standing problem is to avoid, or at least to minimize, the ambiguities resulting therefrom. The aim of the present revision of the original translation has been to help the reader to understand the analysis of the act of knowledge, and to enable him to follow the subsequent chapters without being troubled by ambiguous terms, close quote. In spite of Dr. Papelbaum's removal of certain ambiguities, readers were still troubled by difficulties that did derive from the original German. When I was asked by the publishers to prepare this new edition, it soon became clear to me that further alterations to words and phrases would not be sufficient to remove these difficulties. It may, therefore, be helpful to state briefly what my guiding principles have been in making this translation. Steiner did not write his book as a thesis for students of philosophy, but in order to give a sound philosophical basis to the experience of oneself as a free spirit, an experience that is open to everybody. The book is written in such a way that the very reading of it is a help toward participating in this experience. For this reason, all the terms used must convey a real meaning to the reader, and any explanations required must be in words that are self-evident. Indeed, Steiner states clearly that the terms he uses do not always have the precise meanings given in current scientific writings, but that his intention is to record the facts of everyday experience, parenthesis see pages 27 to 28. I have tried throughout to convey the essential meaning of Steiner's original words, and to follow closely his train of thought, so that the English reader may have as nearly as possible the same experience that a German reader has from the original text. Thus the structure of the original has been preserved sentence by sentence. It might be argued that a free translation, making full use of English idiom and style, would be far more appropriate for an English reader. This could cut out the wordy repetitions and lengthy phrases typical of German philosophical writing, and make for a more readable text. But it would also have to be written out of the English philosophical tradition, and would require a complete reconstruction of Steiner's arguments from the point of view of an Englishman's philosophy. This might be an excellent thing to do, but would constitute a new work, not a translation. Even if it were attempted, there would still be the need for a close translation, making Steiner's path of knowledge available in detail for the English reader. The method I have followed was to make a fresh translation of each passage and then compare it with the existing one, choosing the better version of the two. Where there was no advantage in making a change, I have left the earlier version, so that many passages appear unaltered from the previous edition. This is therefore a thoroughly revised rather than an entirely new translation. It is my hope that it will prove straightforward reading for anyone prepared to follow the author along the path of experience he has described. The following notes, explaining certain of the terms used, are intended for those who want to compare this edition with the German original, or who are making a special study of philosophy. Freedom is not an exact equivalent of the German word Freiheit, although among its wide spectrum of meanings, there are some that do correspond. In certain circumstances, however, the differences are important. Steiner himself drew attention to this, for instance, in a lecture he gave at Oxford in 1922, when he said, with reference to this book, quote, "Therefore, today we need above all a view of the world based on Freiheit." Parenthesis, one can use this word in German, but here in England one must put it differently, because the word freedom has a different meaning. Close parenthesis. One must say a view of the world based on spiritual activity, on action, on thinking and feeling that arise from the individual human spirit. Close quote, parenthesis, translated from the German. Close parenthesis. Steiner also drew attention to the different endings of the words. Freiheit could be rendered literally as freehood, if such a word existed. The German ending heit implied an inner condition or degree, while tum, corresponding to our freedom, dum, implied something granted or imposed from outside. This is only partly true in English, as a consideration of the words manhood, knighthood, serfdom, earldom, and wisdom will show. In any case, meanings change with time, and current usage, rather than etymology, is the best guide. When describing any kind of creative activity, we speak of a, quote, freedom of style, close quote, or, quote, freedom of expression, close quote, in a way that indicates an inner conquest of outer restraints. This inner conquest is the theme of the book, and it is in this sense that I believe the title The Philosophy of Freedom would be understood today. When Steiner questioned the aptness of this title, he expressed the view that English people believed that they already possessed freedom, and that they needed to be shocked out of their complacency and made to realize that the freedom he meant had to be attained by hard work. While this may still be true today, the alternative he suggested is now less likely to achieve this shock than is the original. I have not found that the title, The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity, gives the newcomer any indication that the goal of the book is the attainment of inner freedom. Today it is just as likely to suggest a justification of religious practices. Throughout the book, it is proved quite impossible to translate Freiheit as spiritual activity wherever it occurs. The word appears in the titles of the parts of the book and of some of the chapters. The book opens with the question of freedom or necessity. And the final sentence, page 214, is, quote, "He is free," close quote. Undoubtedly, freedom is the proper English word to express the main theme of the book, and should also appear in the book's title. Times have changed, and what may well have been good reasons for changing the title in 1922 are not necessarily still valid. After much thought and taking everything into account, I have decided that the content of the book is better represented today by the title The Philosophy of Freedom. Moreover, with this title, the book may be instantly identified with Die Philosophie der Freiheit, and I have already remarked that this edition is intended as a close translation to the German, rather than a new book specially written for the English. Spirit, soul, and mind are not precise equivalents in English of the German Geist and Seele. Perhaps because we use the concept of mind to include all our experiences through thinking, the concepts of spirit and soul have practically dropped out of everyday use, whereas in German there is no distinct equivalent for mind, and the concepts spirit, Geist, and soul, Seele, are consequently broader in scope. Any work describing Steiner's point of view in terms of English philosophy would have to deal with the mind as a central theme. But here our task is to introduce readers to Steiner's concepts of spirit and soul. For Steiner, the spirit is experienced directly in the act of intuitive thinking. The human spirit is that part of us that thinks. But the spiritual world is not limited to the personal field of the individual human being. It opens out to embrace the eternal truths of existence. The English word spirit gives the sense of something more universal, less personal than mind. And since Steiner's philosophical path leads to an experience of the reality of the spiritual world, I have kept the word wherever possible, using mind or mental in a few places where it seemed more appropriate. The spiritual activity here meant is thus more than mental activity. Although it starts at a level we would call mental, it leads the human being, aware of himself as a spirit, into the ultimate experience of truth. The soul, too, is directly experienced. It is not a vague metaphysical entity, but is that region in us where we experience our likes and dislikes, our feelings of pleasure and pain. It contains those characteristics of thought and feeling that make us individual, different from each other. In many common phrases we use the word mind, where German has the word Seele. But since Steiner recognizes a distinction between soul and spirit, it is important to keep these different words. Even in modern English usage, something of this difference remains, and it is not too late to hope that Steiner's exact observations in this realm may help to prevent the terms soul and spirit becoming mere synonyms. Therefore, I have kept these words wherever the distinction was important, though in a few places an alternative rendering seemed to fit better. For instance, the, quote, introspective observation, close quote, quoted in the motto on the title page, could have been rendered literally as observation of the soul. This observation involves a critical examination of our habits of thought and feeling, not studied from outside in the manner of a psychological survey of human behavior, but from inside, where each person meets himself face to face. The whole book can be considered as a study of the mind, but using an exactness of observation and clarity of thinking never before achieved. Nevertheless, the stream of materialism still flows so strongly that there is a real danger that the mind, and indeed the whole realm of the soul and the spirit, will be dismissed as a metaphysical construction. Only by adopting a philosophy such as is developed in this book will it be possible to retain an experience of soul and of spirit that will be strong enough to stand up to the overwhelming desire to accept nothing as real unless it is supported by science. For in this philosophy, Steiner opens the door to a science of the spirit, every bit as exact and precise as our current science of nature would be. Concept and percept are the direct equivalents of Begriff and Wahrnehmung. The concept is something grasped by thinking, an element of the world of ideas. Let me read that again. The concept is something grasped by thinking, an element of the world of ideas. Steiner describes what it is at the beginning of chapter 4, see page 47. In describing the percept, see page 51, Steiner mentions the ambiguity of current speech. The German word Wahrnehmung, like the English perception, can mean either the process of perceiving or the object perceived as an element of observation. Steiner uses the word in the latter sense, and the word percept, though not perhaps in common use, does avoid the ambiguity. The word does not refer to an actual concrete object that is being observed, for this would only be recognized as such after the appropriate concept had been attached to it, but to the content of observation devoid of any conceptual element. This includes not only sensations of color, sound, pressure, warmth, taste, smell, and so on, but feelings of pleasure and pain, and even thoughts once the thinking is done. Modern science has come to the conclusion that one cannot deal with a sensation devoid of any conceptual element, and uses the term perception to include the whole response to a stimulus. In other words, to mean the result of perceiving. But even if one cannot communicate the nature of an experience of pure percept to another person, one must still be able to deal with it as an essential part of the analysis of the process of knowledge. Using the word percept for this element of the analysis, we are free to keep the word perception for the process of perceiving. Idea and mental picture, as used here, correspond to the German words Idee and Vorstellung, respectively. Normally these would both be rendered as idea, and this practice led to an ambiguity that obscured a distinction central to Steiner's argument. This was the main cause of Dr. Poppelbaum's concern, and his solution was to render Vorstellung as representation and Idee as idea with a capital I. Though this usage may have philosophical justification, it has been my experience in group studies of this book over many years that it has never been fully accepted in practice. Representation remains a specialist term, with a sense rather different from its usual meaning in English. And it certainly does not have the same obvious meaning for the English reader that Vorstellung has for the German. In explaining his use of the word representation, Dr. Poppelbaum wrote in his preface as follows, quote, "The mental picture which the thinker forms to represent the concept in an individual way is here called a representation." Close quote. Since mental picture is here used to explain the term representation, it seems simpler to use mental picture throughout. It fits Steiner's treatment very well, since it conveys to the reader both the sense of something conceptual, in that it is mental, and the sense of something perceptual, in that it is a picture. In fact, Steiner gives two definitions of the mental picture, one as a, quote, percept in myself, close quote, see page 56, and another as a, quote, individualized concept, close quote, see page 90. And it is this intermediate position between percept and concept that gives the mental picture its importance in the process of knowledge. Another advantage of the term mental picture is that the verb to picture corresponds well with the German vorstellen, implying a mental creation of a scene rather than a physical representation with pencil, paints, or camera, which would be, quote, to depict, close quote. Of course, the visual term picture must be understood to cover also the content of other senses. For instance, a remembered tune or a recollection of tranquility. But this broadening of meaning through analogy is inherent in English usage. Although mental pictures are commonly regarded as a special class of ideas, here the term idea is used only for the German Idee without ambiguity. Ideas are not individualized, but are, quote, fuller, more saturated, more comprehensive concepts, close quote, see page 47. In the later part of the book, when discussing the nature of a conscious motive, Steiner uses the word to include all concepts in the most general way, individualized or not, which comes very close to the English use of the word idea. Imagination means the faculty and process of creating mental pictures. The word is the same as the German Imagination, but I have also used it for the German Fantasie, because the word fantasy suggests something altogether too far from reality, whereas imagination can mean something not only the product of our own consciousness, but also a step toward the realization of something new. Thus the title given to chapter 12, Moral Imagination, parenthesis 4, Moralische Fantasie, close parenthesis, seemed to me to be correct, and I have kept it. It describes the process of taking an abstract idea or concept and creating a vivid mental picture of how it can be applied in a particular circumstance, so that it may become the motive for a moral deed. In later writings, Steiner describes how this ordinary faculty of imagining or making mental pictures can be developed to the point where it becomes the faculty of actually perceiving the creative ideas behind the phenomena of nature. In these later writings, the imagination becomes a special term to indicate this level of perception, but in this book, the meaning remains near to the ordinary usage. However, the gateway to such higher levels of perception is opened through the path of experience here set forth. Intuition is again the same as the German word and means the faculty and process of grasping concepts, in particular the immediate apprehension of a thought without reasoning. This is the normal English usage, though Steiner uses the term in an exact way as follows, see page 80, quote, in contrast to the content of the percept, which is given to us from without, the content of thinking appears inwardly. The form in which this first makes its appearance we will call intuition. Intuition is, for thinking, what observation is for the percept. Close quote. Later in the book, he gives another definition. See page 123. Quote, intuition is the conscious experience in pure spirit of a purely spiritual content. Only through an intuition can the essence of thinking be grasped. Close quote. From this, it is not difficult to see how, again in later writings, Steiner could describe a stage of perception still higher than that called imagination, the stage of intuition in which one immediately apprehends the reality of other spiritual beings. Although this book deals only with the spiritual content of pure thinking, intuition at this level is also a step toward a higher level of perceiving reality. Experience has two meanings, which correspond to different words in German. Quote, actual observation of facts or events, close quote, corresponds to the German Erlebnis and to the verb erleben, while, quote, the knowledge resulting from this observation, close quote, corresponds to Erfahrung. Thus, the accumulation of knowledge can be described as past experience or total sum of experience. If the single word is ambiguous, parenthesis see for instance page 91, close quote. When speaking of human behavior that is based on past experience, Steiner calls it praktische Erfahrung, which is rendered as practical experience. See page 128. On the other hand, having direct experience as an activity of observation is expressed by the verb erleben, which means literally to live through. Thus, in the latter part of the book, particularly in those passages which were added in 1918, see pages 111 and 214, 215, Steiner speaks repeatedly of the thinking which can be experienced. This experience is to be understood as every bit as real and concrete as the actual observation of facts and events described above. Motive and driving force are two elements in any act of will that have to be recognized as distinct. See page 125. They correspond to the German words Motiv and Triebfeder, respectively. Motive, as used by Steiner, corresponds exactly to the common English usage, meaning the reason that a person has for his action. It has to be a conscious motive, in the form of a concept or mental picture, or else we cannot speak of an act of will, let alone a moral deed. An unconscious motive is really a contradiction in terms, and should properly be described as a driving force. It implies that some other person has been able to grasp the concept which was the reason for the action, though the person acting was not himself aware of it. He acted as an automaton, or, as we properly say, without motive. Nevertheless, modern psychology has contrived to define the motive as something no different from the driving force, which precludes the recognition of a motive grasped out of pure intuition, and therefore of the essential difference between a moral deed, where a man knows why he acts, and an amoral one, where his knowledge is a matter of indifference. By making the distinction between motive and driving force, Steiner has been able to characterize all possible levels of action from the purely instinctive to the completely free deed. The literal meaning of Triebfeder is the main spring that drives a piece of clockwork. In previous editions, this was rendered as spring of action, in quotes. While this is legitimate philosophical usage, I found that it was often misunderstood by the ordinary reader, being taken to mean a spring like a fountain or river source, as in the phrase springs of life. This immediately causes confusion with the origin or source of the action, which is the motive. Of course, at the higher levels of action, there is no other driving force than the idea which stands as the motive. But in order to follow the development from lower levels, one must distinguish the idea, which is the motive, from whatever it is in us that throws us into action whenever a suitable motive presents itself. In quotes, mainspring does not always fit well in the text, and after trying various words and phrases, I have chosen, in quotes, driving force, as best expressing the dynamic nature of this part of our constitution. The driving force differs from the motive in that we may well remain unconscious of it. But if we are not conscious of the driving force behind our actions, we cannot be acting in freedom, even though we are aware of our motives. Only if we make our own ideals the driving force of our will can we act in freedom, because then nothing apart from ourselves determines our action. Thus, the final triumph of Steiner's path of development depends on making this clear distinction between motive and driving force. A view that treats all motives as driving forces will not be able to recognize the possibility of freedom, while a view that regards all driving forces as ideal elements will not see the need for overcoming our unconscious urges and habits if freedom is to be attained. Will and want are two distinct words in English, where the German has only one verb, wollen, and its derivatives. Here the task of translating runs into considerable difficulty, for in any discussion of free will, it is important to be clear what willing is. The noun forms are fairly straightforward. Einwollen means, quote, an act of will, close quote. Das Wollen means, in quotes, willing in general. And der Wille means, in quotes, the will. But the English verb to will has a restricted range of meaning, and to use it all the time to render the German wollen can be quite misleading. An example is the quotation from Hemmerling in the first chapter, see page 17. Quote, I'm going to give it my best shot in German here. Der Mensch kann allerdings tun, was will. Aber kann nicht wollen, was will, weil sein Wille durch Motiv bestimmt ist. Close quote. The previous edition rendered this, quote, man can, it is true, do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills, because his will is determined by motives. Close quote. If this means anything at all in English, it means that man cannot direct his will as he chooses. The archaic sense of willing as desiring is kept in the phrase, quote, what he wills, close quote, in keeping with current usage, for instance, in the remark, quote, come when you will, close quote. But the active sense of willing, as contrasted with doing, implies a metaphysical power of compulsion quite out of keeping with Steiner's whole method of treating the subject. This metaphysical attitude to the will is clearly expressed in a sentence such as, quote, I willed him to go, close quote, which implies something more than mere desire, but less than overt action. It is less obvious when dealing with the genesis of one's own actions, but the tendency to attribute a metaphysical quality to the will is developed in Schopenhauer's philosophy, and this may well be a tendency inherent in the German language. Steiner has no such intention, and he leaves us in no doubt that his use of wollen implies a definite element of desire. See page 195. Indeed, the highest expression of man's will is when it becomes the faculty of spiritual desire or craving. German geistige Begehungsvermögen. Therefore, whenever the archaic sense of the verb to will is not appropriate, I have decided that it is better to render the German verb wollen with the English want, and its variants, wanting, to want to, and so on. This makes immediate good sense of many passages, and moreover, if one would translate this back into German, one would have to use the word wollen. Hammerling's sentence now becomes, quote, "Man can certainly do as he wills, but he cannot want as he wills, because his wanting is determined by motives." Close quote. Although Steiner has to show that this view is mistaken, one can at least understand how it could come to be written. That it can be a genuine human experience is shown by that similar remark attributed to T.E. Lawrence, quote, "I can do what I want, but I cannot want what I want." Close quote. In other words, quote, "I can carry out any desires for action that I may have, but I cannot choose how these desires come to me." Close quote. Both Lawrence and Hemmerling leave out of account just those cases where man can want as he wills, because he has freely chosen his own motive. Steiner's treatment of the will overcomes any necessity for metaphysical thinking. For instance, it now makes sense to say that to want without motive would make the will an, in quotes, empty faculty. See page 17. Because to want without wanting something would be meaningless. I have dealt with this at some length because it has been my experience that the message of the entire book springs to life in a new and vivid way when it is realized that the original motive power of the will is in fact desire, and that desire can be transformed by knowledge into its most noble form, which is love. It was the late Friedrich Goethe who showed me, together with many others, the importance of this book as a basis for the social as well as the intellectual life of today. My debt to the previous translators and editors will already be clear. I also owe much to the many friends who have taken part in joint studies of this book over the past 30 years, and to those who have helped and advised me with suggestions for the translation, especially the late George Adams, Owen Barfield, and Rita Stebbing. Finally, I must mention my colleague Ralph Brocklebank, who has shared much of the work, and with Dorothy Osmond prepared it for the press. Michael Wilson, Klent, 1964, and that is the end of the translator's introduction.